So this is my 2008 Chevrolet Cobalt. I raced it in 24 Hours of Lemons, hence why it's kind of painted up like a BMW. We did finish that race, but we happened to blow up the automatic transmission, so now we've got a manual transmission out of a 2003 Saturn Ion. Everything's from the junkyard, including the clutch, the flywheel, everything, except for the engine is still the factory engine. So what I'm going to be doing now is pretty much take everything apart, get the engine out so we can take it apart, check the state of health, and then we'll get to putting the turbocharger on it. Alright, so next we're going to be starting to take apart the suspension so I can get the cradle out of there. And to get that out, I'm also going to just remove the bumper and probably the radiator too, just to make things a little bit easier since I am dropping everything out. I am going to try to do this with as few tools as possible, just to demonstrate how easy it can be. Oh gosh, oh gosh. Of course, right in there. Alright, so as you can see, gotten quite a bit taken off. I'm gonna leave the engine in actually, but I want to drop the subframe to make it easier to take the oil pan off as part of the modifications. I'll have to be drilling a hole for the oil drain back there in the back of the oil pan. So next up is cradle removal. Alright, so now we got the cradle out, so we're going to continue on with the disassembly. The next part that I really want to get off is the cylinder head. So I'm going to start by taking the intake off and valve cover and go from there. And then we have the intake manifold. Comes out pretty easy, really. There we go, valve cover off. Since I'm trying to not use any sort of specialized equipment like a cherry picker, so I'm trying to rebuild this actually inside the vehicle. So to do that, I gotta get this front mount off. But there's only this mount and there's a mount underneath all that wiring over there that's holding the transmission up. So it's gonna be a little sketchy, but I'm gonna use a jack underneath the oil pan to take this off so I can undo the chain, take the front cover off, take the head off, and then probably put the mount back on so that I can take the oil pan off. So, let's go. Alright, now we're going to try to get last few bolts out and the harmonic balancer off. Hopefully this balancer just slides off. I'm pretty sure it does. So I don't need a puller, which will be nice. And then we can put that mount back on there because this is pretty sketchy. gosh. Alright, there we go. Not too bad. Now just a few more bolts. Pop this thing off. It's probably going to leak some oil, which will do just fantastic. Not too bad. There we go. There's our timing chain set up in there. It's actually got a dual chain. One for the balance shaft. It does have two balance shafts. And one for the two camshafts. Alright, so we're going to continue on with the engine teardown. Some of the stuff I got to do is behind here is a 10mm bolt, if I can get that thing loose. It's holding the forward guide into place and attaching to the cylinder head. Because right now we're trying to remove the cylinder head. So essentially anything that holds the cylinder head to the block needs to be removed. And the next thing we're going to take off is there's also a big tensioner on the back side of this engine that is hydraulic and kind of spring loaded. That holds the rear guide into place. We need to get that off, but apparently it's very tight. So essentially this thing is ridiculously tight, which is probably a good thing. So what I'm going to be using instead of that ratchet is I got my just jack handle and a cheap 1/2 inch ratchet because I don't have one that's quite long enough, so it'll give me a little bit extra leverage. So what I need, I think I'm still going to have to get underneath this thing for that. So now we're going to get that thing the rest of the way out. The tensioner is actually reusable. I think I got a new one. You can reset it because it's got a start position. This portion is spring loaded, but it's also hydraulic reactuated, but you can take the seat clip off and then reset the plunger, and then you can reset it once you put it all together. So now we're going to loosen up the cam actuator bolts. These things are usually pretty darn tight as well. Just kind of pull these actuators off. Some oil starts to come out of there. And you do want to be kind of careful with these actuators. This outer ring, it's actually plastic, and if you put a crack in it, it will no longer work. These things are variable cams, so they're hydraulically controlled, and for whatever reason a crack in them maybe lets some hydraulic pressure loose, but then they don't work. So we're actually pretty close about removing the cylinder head. Just got to do a few more things, like getting these coolant hoses out of the way. Alright, and I believe that's it for the electrical connections, so that, and pretty much all the mechanical pieces. So pretty much all that's left is I got 4 bolts over here, so there's the front of the timing chain, then we got 10 head bolts that are actually what kind of clamps the head gasket down. These are more just sealing so no oil leaks out. So I just got to remove those 12 bolts, and yeah, this head should be removed. One of the other things I need to remove before I get all the way to taking the cylinder head off is the exhaust, which I kind of forgot about. Alright, now I just gotta slip this thing off. Let's go. That's fun. There you go. One non-catted downpipe. The only reason I took the cat out was just strictly for supposed gains, you know what they say, when we were racing this, so only reason. Alright, so now we can legitimately get on to actual cylinder head removal because it's literally just the 10 bolts, the 10 head bolts, and this thing should come right apart. And pretty much you want to break all of these loose by hand. They do, I mean, compared to the studs I'm going to put into them, loosening these up is pretty difficult because they like to twist a little bit before the threads start to move. But actually the torque on these is really minimal. But still want to loosen at least everything up by hand and kind of slowly, just so you don't like disrupt the pressure that's on the head already. But after that, I'm just going to use an impact to get it all the way off. And hopefully this thing just comes right off. Alright, let's get this head gasket off of here. Everything seems to be in good shape. I don't see any, like sometimes when these cylinder heads warp or the block has issues, it'll actually burn straight through this entire gasket and it'll be cut. So this gasket being in good shape is a really good sign. Pretty much the next thing I need to do is take off the oil pan, and then I can get the piston rod cap bolts out, and then we can get these pistons out. So now we're moving on to the oil pan removal. It's relatively easy. You just got some bolts that surround it. Get some of these cobwebs out of here. Got some bolts that surround the perimeter of the oil pan. And then I'm missing a couple bolts that typically go into the transmission because once again, this has a manual transmission out of it, out of a Saturn, so this oil pan isn't exactly the right oil pan to be going with this transmission. But I got 2 out of them, so that's pretty good in my book. I'm not too concerned about it. So yeah, I get these 2 bolts out, all of the ones around. I don't have a compressor right here. Typically there's a AC compressor, but I deleted that also for when I ran this thing at 24 hours and lemons. So there's no HVAC in the car at all actually. But so it makes it easier for removing of the oil pan. So just a bunch of 13s, 2 18s, and then just pry it off. This thing does like to be a little difficult to get off sometimes because this is essentially glued on. Then it's also got a couple of alignment pins in the back of the oil pan that just makes it want to just stick on that much more. There we go. Alright, now I got the oil pan off. I need to get some of this chain stuff out of the way because I'm going to need to rotate the crankshaft over so I can get the pistons aligned to get the bolts out. So yeah. So yeah, I guess the last thing we want to do is we're going to have to spin this around to, there's a mark right here. We can put it down on here, that'll get us to top dead center. So I'm just going to put the balancer bolt in. Don't really want to seat this thing super hard because it's going to be bottoming out inside the crankshaft, which would be really bad if you just like drove it on with impact. But pretty much just doing this so we can turn the crankshaft easier. There's just enough resistance that makes it a little difficult to spin from the pistons still being in there, but it doesn't have a whole lot. Alright, so now that we got that on top dead center, we can get to removing the pistons. Alright, so now we're going to be removing the cranking rod bolts. They're just 11mm bolts, nothing too special. So yeah, just pop them loose. Probably use an impact once again to get these off. Try not to get rained on by oil. is one cap. We're going to want to keep them in order, and the correct orientation is always best, because these caps will only fit on the exact rod they came off of, because they're actually a fractured connecting rod, which means that they're cast as one piece and then broken, because when you put it together it actually holds very strong. Alright, so next thing we're going to want to do is very gently push these pistons up. I don't really have anything in particular to press them up nicely. I usually go for trying to push up on the bolt holes themselves, so I'm just going to probably use a couple of extensions because they shouldn't cause any issues. Voila, there's all our pistons. Alright, so now we got all the pistons out. And the next thing I want to check is just make sure there's no like grooves in the cylinder wall. So on this one, you can see it's actually, to me it looks like it's in really good shape. Another thing you can do, if you just want to double check, is you just run your finger, like your fingernail, around there, and you're feeling for any sort of catching. You don't want to feel anything at all. You're also looking for like a X-type cross pattern. See if I can get a good picture of it. You can see the like scratches that are kind of going along the wall. That's what you want. It kind of makes an X. That's pretty much to help with oiling, because oil is actually what's helping seal these cylinders with the piston rings. And actually everything looks pretty darn good, so I'm pretty happy with that. I'm just going to clean this up. So now we're going to do some cleaning of the block surface. And we want to be pretty careful, because pretty much any sort of groove in here could cause some sort of sealing issue, whether it be coolant, oil, compression. So you want to be pretty careful when you're cleaning up a cylinder head gasket surface. Once we get this clean, then we're going to proceed to do like a flatness check on the surface of the deck, which has got to be pretty darn flat, or you are running the risk of your head gasket failing. And then you, especially under boost, you don't want that to happen, because there's such higher combustion chamber pressures. When you have a slight warp on the block, it's just not going to seal as good. And then you're going to have a pretty massive engine failure, which is not good. With a very light pressure, just scrape off all of this gasket material that was left over from the head gasket. And sometimes you get a little bit of coolant residue, I guess, that kind of seeps in there. That's kind of what this like white color is on there. And typically you want to use a microfiber towel when you're cleaning off the head gasket surface. If you're using like a shop rag, they like to kind of break down a lot and leave some fibers on the actual sealing surface itself, which would be pretty bad. Once again, this isn't the final thing. I just want to check for flatness with a straight edge and a feeler gauge. So I got my straight edge, pretty much perfectly flat surface right here. I've been using this for a few years. It's still in pretty good shape. Every once in a while you do want to get them like a new one just to make sure it's perfectly flat, but this one's still pretty new. So there's a few different directions you want to check for flatness. You also want to choose one of these feeler gauges. These are a specific thickness. They have the measurements right on each gauge, like each little leaf. My specification for this engine for the block flatness is 0.002, which is not a lot of metal at all. It's more like just, I think it's actually thinner than a piece of paper. So it's pretty darn thin. But pretty much what we're going to do is, we want to put it flat across all of the cylinders. We want to check, will this go in under every place where there's metal touching. And you can see I'm not really putting hardly any pressure on this. I'm not like pushing it down in the middle or one edge. I'm just holding it in place on top. And my feeler gauge is not going in under any of them. So that tells me I'm pretty much perfectly flat. I think I only got one size smaller than this one, which is 0.0015 inches of thickness. You can just see if that's going to go through there. I don't think it will, but nope. So this is pretty much tells me this is perfectly flat, exactly what I want to see. So now we're going to proceed to the main reason I took all of this apart, which is to check the piston ring end gap when they're installed inside the engine. As you can see right now, it's obviously pretty big because it's not compressed, but once they get installed, that gap's going to get pretty tight. Yeah, so right there. And the last thing we want it to do is touch, which under heat, which we're going to have a lot more of that because we're going to be putting a turbocharger on there, they're going to want to touch a lot easier. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to disassemble everything. I'm going to keep everything separate because you don't really want to put a ring that's already been worn to a cylinder on a different piston. But we're going to take it all apart. We're going to put them in each of the respective cylinders. We're going to measure this gap with a feeler gauge, and then we're going to run a little calculation. It's a pretty simple calculation to see what our gap is supposed to be for our, we're going to be like a street car with a turbocharger, and then we're going to file them if needed. So to take a piston apart is pretty easy. You just kind of slide it up there very gently. These things are kind of brittle, so you don't really want to force anything. And actually these, once again, everything looks like it to be in pretty darn good shape. It's a little bit dirty, but nothing crazy at all. So yeah, just gonna take everything apart. Then this bottom ring set, we're not really gonna worry about its gap. This is strictly for oiling, but it's 3 rings all in the one ring location. 2 steels, and then you got this wave plate set of rings. And there we are. All right, now we're gonna do one of the most fun parts, which is cleaning. All right, so one of the things I'm gonna carefully do is if you look on the middle ring, you can see there's a beveled edge. There's some carbon buildup in my middle rings, so I'm just going to very gently with this straight pick just try to clean some of that out. Alright, let's start working on cleaning up these pistons some. There's really not a lot. This whole engine's in a lot better shape than I thought it was going to be, especially just after driving it so hard. So once again, I'm not really trying to go for perfection because this is immediately going to get carbon buildup on it, but it doesn't hurt. Yeah. All right, so we're back over here at the engine, and what we're going to be doing now is actually putting in the rings, measuring what the gaps currently are, and then filing them if we need to. So I ran a little bit of a calculation. You can find what your ring gap is supposed to be for whatever type of engine you're trying to build, pretty much from any of the major manufacturers of pistons, Weisco, JE Pistons. They all have their own charts. Pretty much found out what mine's supposed to be. For our top ring and our middle ring, you don't really need to worry about the bottom ring set. What we're going to be wanting to do here is we're going to take the ring and we're going to put it in each of the respective cylinders. Then we're going to push them down with the piston so we can actually get it into where the ring will ride normally. You don't want to have it at the bottom, you don't want to have it at the bottom or the top, because that's really not where the piston rides. Then we're also going to be using the piston to push it down so that the ring will be perfectly centered inside the cylinder itself, not like one of these directions, because just putting it by hand is not really perfectly centered. Alright, we're going to push it down a little ways with the piston. We're going to take our feeler gauge. Once again, same tool we use to measure the block flatness. And we're just going to start with a guess on what we think the thickness is going to be. I'm going to start with just 0.01 and just check. So we know we're bigger than 0.01 for that cylinder. I actually ran a calculation for what I want for my my piston ring gap. I found it to be, I want it to be 0.017. So if we got this for all of them, that would actually be perfect because it'll save us a lot of time. We're actually looking to be slightly wider than that, so we're gonna be good. I might as well check and see what we got for all of them. Having a little bit wider is not too much of a big deal as long as it's not crazy wider. The only thing it's gonna possibly do is make it a little bit less compression just because of a little bit of cylinder leakage. And possibly a little bit of oil consumption. All right, it's looking like cylinder 1 is 0.022 and the rest of the cylinders are 0.02. So we're pretty close to what we calculated we wanted. It's a little bit wider, so it's actually a little bit safer. Gives a little bit more room for possibly increasing the boost later if we decide to. I know these rods aren't really rated at super high boost levels, the stock rods. So we might not, but at least this tells me that I'm not going to blow up the engine because of piston ring touching. So I'm going to pull all these out. I'm going to put the second rings in there. They'll probably be good. I would assume they're going to be good considering how the top rings were. But definitely doesn't hurt to check. All right, so we got them all down. Then we're going to start with 0.017 again. These are actually, I need them to be more like 0.019. I think, according to a lot of the piston manufacturers, we want them to be slightly wider than the top rings. But if they're close, once again, I'm not going to worry about it too much. Well, that ended up being pretty much perfect as well. So a little bit of wasted time, but definitely worth the check. So now we're on to the piston ring installation. It's just the same as removing everything, just in reverse. So we're going to start with our piston and our waved ring, which goes on the bottom. And you just slide it on like so, just with a little amount of tension as possible. And then I like to install them just by kind of staggering where the end gaps meet. So pretty much just rotate it like a third of a turn every time you install one. And just slide them on there. The next one to go on is going to be the one with a beveled edge. At least for this engine, I'm pretty sure almost all have a beveled edge. If you look closely, there's a little bit of an edge on it, and that's going to actually go down. If you also look at the top, there's going to be that indent in it, and that means that goes up. So once again, just put one edge down, slide it around, give a little tension, and drop it in its spot. And then the top ring, it can go either direction on this specific motor. It doesn't have any identification for what's the top, what's the bottom, and that's pretty much how it goes. So once again, I try to not put the ends in the exact same spot, so I just rotate it to the other side. You can adjust this all later too, once you get them installed. Slide one end in and work the other one around. That's pretty much it. So now let me do it to all the pistons. And that's it. Pretty easy.